Stay connected with the latest news across your world. Power 98.7. Now we're talking.
26 minutes before 8 on the Power Business this Monday evening. And in our Africa segment, we're looking at the third G20 finance ministers and central bank governors meeting in KZN last week. And that focused on keeping the global economy stable while pushing for more inclusive growth and stronger financial system. Let's speak now to Dr. Dale McKinley, who's a political economist, about the outcomes of that important meeting. A very good evening, Dale, and welcome to the Power Business.
Good evening, Tehillah, and thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
The communiqué that was released by the finance ministers and central bank governors yesterday, just before the weekend, highlights some of the biggest risks to the global economy. How did they address this in their discussions and in their final communiqué?
Well, it depends on where you want to start, because there are many different aspects to that global financial problems architecture. So it was basically a smorgasbord, if you want to, and which is I think to be expected. So they addressed everything from macroeconomic policies to central bank roles to debt. To financial regulation and climate issues, financing, taxation issues and others. Basically, if you take all of those, and I'm sure we'll break those down a little bit more, but if you take all of them, if the gist of what the communiqué is basically saying is trying to please pretty much everyone in that sort of wide club. And so they use all the right words in talking about more transparency, more information sharing, welcoming all the different kinds of research and things that are going on, strengthening existing, for example, financial task force regulations and transparency issues around climate and development bank financing and so forth. But I think generally speaking, it's if one wants to take an overall look at it in terms of their approach, is to basically say that while we welcome all these international things, the underlying notion is that most of these things have got to be country specific and they mustn't involve attacks on the sovereignty of each of the countries. So I think they're trying to strike a balance in that regard.
And of course, that is a very important balance. One of the items that actually surprised people that they had agreed to was the independence of the central bank and the importance of central bank's independence. Of course, the United States did not attend in its full capacity. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was not there. That was where all the headlines were talking about. But do you think that this is significant, the independence of central banks?
I think in some ways it's interesting, as you say. I think the rhetoric doesn't really match the reality in certain cases with some of the members of the G20. So while it might apply in most, I would say the majority of the G20 members, there are certain countries, let's for example say Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and others where to talk about central bank independence is to basically, I think, be a little bit not in touch with the reality of the situation and the fact of who calls the shots in those countries in terms of government control. So while it's to be welcomed as a principle, I think in practice it's a bit far from being matched by that reality.
One of the items going into this meeting that was up for discussion was the high debt levels affecting developing countries. How do you believe that was actually addressed?
Yeah, well, if you look at what they were saying, particularly about, and this is for low and middle income countries in particular, I think what they're basically calling for is this, it's called, the G20 Common Framework, which was previously adopted. And that common framework basically says that there should be a very structured approach, one which is cognizant of coordinating, payments relative to people's and countries' abilities to pay those debts. So that, in other words, not forcing incredibly onerous conditions onto countries, which has obviously been the complaint of a lot of low and middle income countries, structural adjustment programs and so forth. And I think it's more of a call for coordination, call for structure, and and they used the word which I thought was interesting for the IMF, the World Bank, to adopt feasible options for debt repayments. So essentially they're calling for a little bit more equity, a little bit more patience, and a little bit more structured debt relief.
Speaking of some of the fairer systems that this meeting tried to tackle, one of the issues is around global tax global tax architecture. South Africa's been quite vocal about that, the need to have a fair tax system that impacts corporations globally. Do you believe that the statement will actually move the needle, considering the fact that the United States at the moment is an unpredictable player in all of this?
Yeah, look, I mean, that's the sort of, elephant in the room in the certain sense of what's the U.S. going to do. But I think it's important that the G20 says certain things around taxation. If you read the statement, they call for a level playing field. They call for more dialogue, tax sovereignty, which is interesting. In other words, again, this balance between the sovereignty and the global sort of integration issues, and of course transparency. Now, again, rhetoric and reality sometimes are different, but I think in that context, what is more important is what they're saying in terms of relation to equity, in terms of where people and corporations and very wealthy individuals are taking advantage of the system and not paying taxes and profit seeking and other kinds of things. And I think they mention it very briefly, but I think it's important that they do, because in our context in South Africa and Africa, this is a huge issue with regards to taxation, as we know in our own country. So in that sense, this is a gradual piece by piece approach, which I think is inching things along a little bit in the right direction.
As you noted, climate, of course, being a major issue, and the G20 finance ministers noting that there's been significant progress made within financial institutions around the technologies and the infrastructure that's required for adaptation and resilience.
Yeah, I think here they're fudging the things a little bit. I must say. I mean, look, they do say, the multilateral development bank and the climate funds and basically they use this word interoperability quite regularly in terms of the coordination of all the different components of this. But I think in the context of, again, the reality, if one looks at the G20 countries and looks at who's the largest carbon emitters and who's the largest polluters and where they're trying to push these things, they're trying to balance this between those that are on the sort of bottom side of that. So for example, the low and middle income countries, which are being asked to adapt unfairly so by many of the wealthier countries. And I think this is where they're trying to strike this balance, where I say they're fudging it a little bit, because they use the word voluntary all the time. So it's voluntary and voluntary. So in this sense, I think they could be much, much stronger, but it's understood that in the context of the interests that are at play here, very powerful interests, that they're going to sort of try to find a middle ground. And the other point about this is to say that their reliance on private sector carbon markets, I don't think is proven to be particularly successful in addressing the climate issue. And I think that and that's why I say they're fudging a bit on this one.
Interesting to see the Joint Finance Health Task Force looking at ways to respond and also to prepare for pandemics.
Yes, I think that's a very positive thing. I think there is a realization that if we're going to have another pandemic, it's just a question of time, and the preparedness and the ability to address these things has to be international. I mean, if there was a lesson from COVID, it was that we cannot do this on a country by country basis and be all over the place. Again, the elephant in the room is the United States. If this happens within the next 2 or 3 years, well, God help us all with Trump in charge.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So definitely some serious preparations being made there. And overall, do you think that this statement, it covered so many issues, as you highlighted previously, was able to address many of the concerns that developing countries have, as well as a lot of the concerns that Africa has, and they pinned them on South Africa to represent them at the G20?
Yeah, listen, I think, again, I said this before, it's symbolically important that South Africa is heading this up, and that they're adopting that, the sort of inequality, sustainability kind of mantra. While, again, I think the gap between what is being said and what is being done is quite large, what's important is that the shifts that are happening in the global architecture, both financially as well, that we see constantly, and particularly now, given the sort of retreat of the United States from a lot of of this arena presents a lot of good opportunities. And this is a good time for South Africa and many of the countries in the South to be at the forefront of calling for more equity, of calling for more, an equal playing field. So in that sense, while again we need to be realistic about what these communiques say and what they're going to do in practice, I think symbolically and procedurally it's an important thing in pushing the needle a little bit further down the road in the context of more positive transparency, equality, and inclusivity on the financial and particularly global markets.
The next meeting is going to be held in Washington, D.C. in October of the finance track at least. But then we should have a clear idea if President Trump is going to be coming to the G20 meeting in South Africa in November.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're all going to be guessing, I'm pretty sure, until the last minute probably about what he's going to do. Yeah. I mean, that's his game, isn't it? As to keep people guessing all the time. So, and again, I mean, while it is important, and I think it would be important for the United States to be fully involved, I'm not sure that Trump's presence himself is going to be a deal breaker because fundamentally, I think, a lot of the things that are being talked about here are going to be dealt with at departmental and country-specific levels and within all the boards and different kinds of entities that are set up for these things. The question is whether or not Trump is going to try to push the United States out of a lot of these things and basically just leave the scene. I don't think so, but I think that is where the United States involvement is going to be very, very important because we've already seen how the impact and the negative impact that can have on other areas, for example, in terms of healthcare and the United States pulling out at the last minute.
Right from the World Health Organization. Thanks very much. That's Dr. Dale McKinley, who's a political economist, talking to us about the communiqué that came out of the finance track who met last week, the G20 finance track who met last week in KZN.